Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on precision livestock farming and sensing technologies in extensive systems. It's been organised jointly by BSAS, British Society of Animal Science, the PLF Commission of the European Federation of Animal Science, and the Stapleton Trust. And the chair of today's webinar is Tony Waterhouse. Tony was the former head of Scotland Royal College's Hilda Mountain Research Centre, and he now holds an SRUC Emeritus Fellowship. So over to you, Tony. Welcome, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much, Cled. Yeah, and also now welcome everybody to this event, and try and let's move it on quickly. So, as Cled said, we've got the events being put together by BSAS, Stapleton Memorial Trust, and AAP. BSAS are carrying quite a lot of the weight with this, and they've asked me to plug their event, a couple of things. So before we move into the main thing, let's just mention the fact that on their events page on the website, you can find out about their annual conference, which is coming up in April, a virtual conference, but clearly early bird registrations are open shortly. And they're also running a very similar event to this one on biodiversity in grasslands in January. So again, if you could promote this amongst yourselves and colleagues, that will be great. Okay. I hope many of you saw the first webinar. This is the second one. We had the first one on Tuesday in UK time, which saw a number of examples of precision livestock farming technologies for grassland systems being talked about and discussed, and with a few big questions that came up, and we'll try and bring them into our final discussion if appropriate. Very much issues like who owns the data, how can we afford these systems, and should the farmers pay for all the technology, and other ways that other elements of the farming ecosystem can involved in paying for that. So we're going to start off shortly. What I want to do is, again, just encourage you to follow some good etiquette rules. So remind you, everybody on mute, everybody video off, use the chat box, make sure that box is open. And please participate actively through that. What we want to see is questions from you. So please, by all means, ask questions directly of the speakers, directly of the other participants. Say, do you agree with that, or what do you think, or anybody know anything about this? And thirdly, let's make sure we pick up some big questions for the final discussion session that's going through. So the theme of today is very much the sort of future of precision livestock farming systems in our more extensive livestock systems and our grassland systems out there. And we've been lucky enough to pull together 3 speakers from practical academia who will take us through some of those stories. And we're going to move from the animal-centered approach to a farm and landscape-centered approach to space. And then after them, we've got 3 speakers from the commercial world who again are going to illustrate their talk by something about what they're doing, but also moving on. So we'll have that mixture of academia and commercial companies who've got the job of making these things work. So let's move on quickly then to our first speaker, Mark Trotter, who's going to feature very much on the animal-centered world, the animal husbandry approach to precision livestock farming. He's based at the Central Queensland University in Australia. He's a leader of their precision livestock group. He's going to introduce some elements of his work in there. So if I can pass the virtual podium to Mark, let's go.
Good afternoon, folks. Mark Trotter here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of animal husbandry using sensor technologies. So a little bit of background on myself first. I'm the Associate Professor in Precision Livestock Management at CQ University, based in Rockhampton, Central Queensland. I lead the Precision Livestock Management group here at CQ University. I grew up on a dairy farm in New South Wales, and have a background in dairy and sort of beef operations. Did my Bachelor of Rural Science and PhD at the University of New England. The Australian one is, that is, not the US one. I've worked as an agribusiness banker out in the industry, and I have a lot of hands-on experience, I guess, in animal management. So what do we do here at CQ University? We do a lot of hardware testing, so that's taking stuff off developers and putting it onto animals and seeing how it works. We develop algorithms that turn the data that comes off those devices into actual useful information for producers. We research the value propositions that are associated with animal sensors, what it will actually return to enterprises. We do a little bit of blue sky development in terms of looking at different applications. And we also explore things like industry preparedness and future adoption issues that might be related with this technology coming along. Just for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that you folks know a little bit about sensor technologies and this idea of a smart tag, and that we actually have something like this available to us. So this is the concept of having, you know, a device on an animal that's recording key bits of data and transferring that up via some sort of communications network to remotely deliver it to a producer in a as useful information on some sort of device. The key information that we're interested in is things like GPS, location, say accelerometer activity, and maybe some proximity data about relationships between individual animals. At the moment, there's nothing that you can really quite go and buy off the shelf in large numbers and at an affordable price. But there's certainly a lot of companies out there on their way and just about there in terms of delivering this tool. But for the purposes of this talk, I guess I'm going to assume that we've got that sort of device out there working, that it's operational, reliable, and critically affordable as well. And sort of ask that question, what does the future look like in terms of animal husbandry if we had that sort of device? And I think it actually depends on who you are in the value chain. So at the farm level, it's really about, you know, increased resolution of monitoring and management. And so being able to understand what's going on with your animals in a lot more detail than you can currently do, and then respond much faster. And in Australia, particularly, be able to find that animal in an extensive landscape to implement a management response. If you're a farm supplier of products, there's some value in it as well for you, we think. And at the post-farm gate level, looking at how processors could use the data, and then also informing the consumer as well. And then there's some really interesting applications for government and regulatory agencies in terms of things like biosecurity. So jump in and have a look at a little bit more detail in terms of where we believe producers can gain benefits in terms of refining those animal husbandry practices and decisions. We actually asked a whole bunch of producers to fill out a survey for us and just said, if you had access to this data, what would you be using it for? What would be important for your operation? They came back with a great diversity of different applications, everything from looking at water-related behaviours, welfare monitoring, mustering efficiency, just knowing where they are to go out and bring them in, all the way through to things like predation detection, stock theft, and then some really interesting applications around feed-based management as well. So as part of that project, we also went out and put out tracking collars with producers, gave them the devices that they could actually put on their animals and get data off and explore that with them. So this is a property Rosebank out at Longreach, Western Queensland, and we just looked at, in this situation, how sheep behaviour changed around the use of water for weaner lambs, which are quite vulnerable because they're not necessarily well socialised. In this situation, you can see the green sheep, marked in green, has gone into the water point, whereas the red sheep, the red weaner lambs, just walked straight past. That sheep didn't go in that day to get a drink, and we can actually objectively measure that using these sort of sensor systems. You can also look at it over time, and in this particular situation, this weaner lamb didn't go in to drink for 3 days when it was first put into that paddock. That's a socialisation problem, and at the moment, the producer doesn't know that that's happening, but with these sort of sensor systems, we can actually know that that's an issue and then go in and implement a management strategy that would ameliorate the fact that that's become a problem. Some of the other applications, producers that we work with, Brad and Tracy Wooldridge over at Western Australia, and their application of interest was just a very basic one of being able to detect whether their sheep were being stolen. So you might remember you English kicked us out about a couple of 100 years ago and sent us all to Australia as convicts, and some of us haven't changed a great deal. We're still out there stealing livestock. It's not just an Australian problem, it's an international issue as well. But these sensor technologies very simply can pick up whether an animal is being pushed along through under duress, put into a set of yards, and then obviously put on a truck and taken away. So we can actually detect that as it's happening and provide an alert eventually to the producer so that they can go and deal with that particular problem. Some of the other applications that producers are interested in, Jack England's from Shepherd Hills in South Australia, looking at detecting plant poisoning as a problem. And so there's an issue down there with Phalaris toxicity or staggers, endophyte poisoning. And we can actually look at the behaviour changes of those sheep and develop an algorithm that alerts for when that is becoming a problem to allow them to go out and intervene. And so there's a whole bunch of other diseases out there that there's potential to actually apply this sort of sensor technology to at least detect that there's a problem, if not actually detect the specific disease itself based on peculiar characteristics that it might have. Taking a step back more broadly, producers were also interested in terms of things like understanding landscape utilisation. So in this situation back at Rosebank at Longreach, looking at how the sheep graze differently across different parts of the paddock. And in this situation, they're interested in putting in another water point so that they could distribute the grazing pressure across that paddock a little bit better. So that's got sustainability outcomes, but it's also got nutritional outcomes for the sheep as well, as they're having to walk less distance in terms of getting back to water and have access to other pasture areas. There's some other really interesting applications as well. So Brad and Tracy Wooldridge also looking at how the sensor data coming back off animals provides alerts to changes in the feed base. In this situation, the grazing behaviour of their sheep as they were put into different pastures changed on the different pastures, but also as the pasture declined. And they're really keen to see how they can use that to refine pasture rotations, but also when to put out supplement and other ameliorants like that. So jumping now back before the farm and looking at the service providers, there's a bunch of interesting applications there in terms of how they're looking at taking advantage of the data that's coming through. We did a trial with a company, Ytex, that do a chemical ear tag. And it's not rocket science. When you've got buffalo fly, which is what this ear tag is targeted at, harassing your cattle, they sit there and they shake their heads, and we can pick that up really easily with an accelerometer sensor. We can actually quantify how agitated these cows are based on that particular head shaking and movement. And in this situation, we're looking at testing out the efficacy of the control tag, which was great, it worked really well, but we could also use it to actually measure, in this case, the cow that didn't have a tag, her situation got so bad that we had to actually bring them into the yards and treat. And you can see the dramatic drop in that. And so the supply companies are looking at this in terms of understanding what's going on out in the industry to be able to target, obviously, sales of products, but streamline their production flows of inputs. And so there's a whole bunch of applications in terms of particularly the animal pharmaceuticals that are of interest in that space. Jumping forward to the processor end of things now, there's a whole bunch of applications there in terms of understanding what's going on out in the industry if the processors could get access to this data. We did some work with one vertically integrated supply chain, so from growing all the way through to processing Australian Country Choice, just tracked a handful of animals in this situation through from backgrounding, which is their pasture phase, onto the feedlot, and then through into the slaughter plant. And what we found was something really interesting, and obviously very low numbers in this particular situation, so we're not running out to publish this, but we've certainly gone on to start thinking about how we can explore it in more detail. The relationship between paddock activity back in the grazing phase and final carcass pH, which is one of these meat quality characteristics. It's an indicator of dark cutting and a significant issue for us around here in central Queensland. And so essentially those animals that were walking less out in the grazing phase of the production cycle, we're actually bumping up towards a much higher pH. So there's still a lot of work to be done in understanding this, but there's some real interest in terms of the processes and being able to have access to data like this that might give them an early indicator of animals that are going to cause problems in terms of meat quality later on, and then trying to find ways to ameliorate that as well. So there's a whole bunch more work needs to be done, but there's certainly some interest in that space. Then at the consumer level, there's obviously a whole bit of interest in improved welfare measures and being able to objectively measure that, and sustainability measures as well. On the welfare front, it sounds relatively simple to use a smart tag to measure aspects of welfare, but when you actually look at welfare in its entirety, it actually gets quite complicated. We had a student, El Fogarty, working on a program with a company called NZ Merino that sells their wool by a certain welfare standard, and looked at how do we take sensor technology and then use that to quantify different aspects of welfare. And we use the 5 domains model. And if you're particularly interested, have a look at that paper. It explains it in more detail. But it becomes relatively complicated when you're trying to, say, objectively measure welfare using sensor systems, because there's so many components to that. In terms of government and regulators, they're certainly very excited and interested in this sort of technology. In Australia, we've got our National Livestock Identification System that allows us to trace back animals through the value chain to see where they've come from for things like disease and carcass contaminants. And obviously, Smart Tag would bring a whole new suite of information that would be very valuable in a lot of those contexts, both in terms of understanding where animals have come from and gone to, but also things like actually detecting some of these diseases like foot and mouth and anthrax, and we think there's some big roles to be played there. So I guess in summary, the future looks great and really bright. There's a whole bunch of opportunities to refine the way animal husbandry is undertaken using sensor technologies, but there's still some challenges ahead. And I mean, one of the key ones is getting the hardware systems working reliably and affordably for an extended period of time. So I'm always rattling off and saying, we need these things out there for 3 years in the real world, working in a cow's ear or a sheep's ear and being retained and still functioning before we know we can, trust them running for that sort of period of time. Outside that, there's some other really interesting challenges, I think. So things like acceptance by the industry, some real issues around privacy concerns in terms of producers and their data on their animals, and things like how much information is too much information if we're looking at providing that to the consumer. How much do they want to know? How much do they need to know? And so there's some thought that needs to go into that as well. And then expectations around response to problems. That's a really key issue. And so being able to actually get out and treat an animal in some Australian situations that you might have been alerted that there's a problem about, actually being able to get out there and treat that animal is quite a challenge. And so we need to think about how we're going to deal with that particular issue as well. Righto, that wraps me up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's great. What we're going to do is move on. I see we've had quite a number of questions in. Some of sort of quite technical, and you've answered some of those already. We've also had what I thought was a big question on data and how we pool it, and I think we're going to push that to the end. So maybe we can just come back to a relatively simple one in terms of actually whether somebody again picked up, do you put a collar on every animal? I think the question is, do you foresee a system where it's a collar or a tag or some sensor? Is it going to every animal? And small farmer in one part of the world may have 50 sheep. In your part of the world, somebody's got 10,000 cows out there in thousands of ways. How do you see the future being about individual animal sensors or other approaches, and what are the any pluses and minuses of that?
Yeah, sure. So it's a really good question. It's something we actually explored and did some economic modelling around. Is do we need them on every animal, or can we have them on a small proportion? And it depends on the application. So for something like stock theft, we can probably have them on less than 2% of the animals, and we can detect the herd or flock behaviour to provide an alert. But if you want to do something like, say, estrus detection, or say for an automated pre-testing type situation, then you need to have that tag on every animal. But there are certainly value propositions back at just having a proportion of the animals sort of tracked, and there's value and returns for producers in that situation. Yeah. Oh, Tony, you're on mute, I think.
I can't press the buttons. I appreciate that. Thank you for keeping me right. Yeah, again, we've had a question here about welfare and stress. I think that's another big topic we're going to push to the end if we can at this moment, and pick up other ones, because I think we've got options here. And again, if people can look at the chat box, they can pick up the to and from there. So thanks very much, Mark. We're going to move on to our second speaker today. That's David Stevens from Ag Research in New Zealand, where he's a senior scientist working out there in practical farming systems and on their research farms. David is he's a past president of the New Zealand and Grassland Association, so he's not an animal man. He's very much a systems man. The grass, the animal, and very much, if you look at his publications and his history, is looking at technology transfer. And what we're going to have from Dave today is a story about moving precision livestock farming into management, and also moving beyond the animal into the farm system and potentially into the landscape. So again, without further ado, let's pass the virtual mic to David to start.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation to present. And today we want to present a little bit of the work that we have been doing around virtual herding, and in particular what changes in future landscape use might look like. So my co-authors and I have been working on this for the past 18 months, and we have been partnered up in that with Pamu, one of our corporate farmers in New Zealand, and Adjacents, who are the owners of the technology that we'll be talking about. So let's look at the technology to start with. The virtual herding collar resides on the animal. There it is in the center left of the screen. It has some solar panels to make sure that it operates continuously without having to be recharged or come back into the holding facilities. It has a GPS as well as some other accelerometers and such like other technology in the collar. It has an audio cue, which it provides the animals with a cue as to where the fence actually is, and then it has the opportunity to apply a little bit of adverse stimulus to remind the animal to return to the inclusion area. The farmer on the right has an app where he can define the boundaries of the paddock. They get sent to the cloud, they get loaded up into a base station, which then transmits that information via a LoRa network to the collar. And then once that those boundaries are set in the collar, then the collar just needs to see the satellites to keep that fence integrity intact. Now this example here just provides you with a heat map of 24 hours worth of data, which has been gained from 45 rising 2-year-old steers that were using the environment. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the permanent fence. You can also see the virtual fence line. The permanent fence is actually at the top of the hill, and you can see therefore that we've actually shifted the top of the hill down to where the virtual fence is, and the animals continue to use that particular environment for resting and relaxation. So what have we been working on? Well, we've been working on the question that after virtual herding has successfully been introduced, what will the future actually look like? And to do that, we used a lead user group, those people who are early adopters of the technology or have some detailed knowledge. And inside of that, we had agribusiness, industry, corporate farming, ordinary farmers, and science all represented. And we studied that question through the lens of production, the environment, landscapes, and enterprises. So as we go through that process, what we very quickly found was this is an enabling technology. This means that we can get other things done, things that we may not have been able to do before because of the fixed nature of some of our infrastructure around fencing, for example. But as we went through, we also found that we could regroup a lot of our thoughts around how the technology would develop over time, how applications would develop over time, how impact on people would change over time, and of course, the outcomes. So in that process, then let's look at the virtual herding technology itself. And in the first instance, we're looking at what is a viable minimum product. That viable product at the moment will be for animals over 250 kilos, probably growing animals, but at this point in time, not breeding animals. However, we are working or have done some work looking at the interaction of, for example, cows and calves, cows with collars, calves without, and how that influences the integrity of the fence. And that appears to be quite a useful step forward for us. And so the minimum viable product will change over time. The other thing, as I say, there are already accelerometers in the collars, but the next step will be looking at integrating other sensors. And in this instance here in the middle photograph, what we have is a urine sensor on the back of a cow, determining the nitrogen loads of the urine, the size of the potential urine patch, and where it's actually deposited. Now, if you integrate that with the ability to move the animal around in the landscape, then you can change nutrient distribution, for example, across the landscape. You can minimize potential environmental impacts. In the future, of course, then we're actually looking at landscape digitization, and that's where the GIS information may well be resident in the collar, and predetermined areas such as waterways, bogs, areas of danger to the animal, cliffs, are already pre-programmed, and so that then the farmer just needs to move the animal around in the landscape without having to worry about those things. And in that digitization, of course, comes the opportunity to report back to your consumer, to society, on the placement of that animal in the environment and the conditions under which it is thriving. So we move on to applications now. These came out in the 4 areas that we see there. The environmental protection, and that is highest on our list in New Zealand because we have legislation being enacted right now to protect waterways, and particularly for fencing of stock out of waterways. And this particular technology provides a significantly lower cost option than permanent fencing, and a much more flexible option in that you can restrict animals when seasonal waterways are running, and yet you may be able to graze that area at other times of the year. So you have a much more flexible opportunity to control potential impacts on water. Beyond that, there's things like biodiversity protection and the redistribution of nutrients environment, which we've already talked a little about, which will reduce the potential for things like nitrate leaching. In the productivity space, as we utilize the landscape more effectively by being able to move animals around and hold them in places where they need to utilize that feed, then what we can see is in the short term we see utilization of feed, but in the long term we see changes in feed quality in the whole landscape, and therefore improvements in productivity. In terms of landscape development, what we're looking here is the ability to introduce new plants and new biodiversity into those landscapes. And you see in the middle photograph there an area that has been sprayed off in preparation for the inclusion of specialist legumes into that environment, which will raise the productivity of the environment, raise the feed quality of the environment, but is able to be controlled and managed specifically without having expensive infrastructure spend, having to fence it. And then in the long term, we're looking at enterprise change. And enterprise change will be where we can actually introduce new crops and new opportunities into landscapes that were traditionally only meant for livestock and could only be used by livestock because of the issues with fencing. Now, of course, we can also introduce animals into environments where they haven't been in the past by being able to control them in vineyards and orchards, for example, or even on lifestyle blocks around the city. Impacts on people have become extremely important. And in the very first instance, obviously, a technology like this requires training. And so that becomes the minimum need in the very first instance. People need to understand how to apply the boundaries, but they also need to understand how the animal is going to react. As we go into the future, then it's going to be the skills that are needed in those environments and on farm. And all of a sudden, the skills are going to change. We're going to need people who understand technology much, much better, people who understand GIS and GPS, people who understand LoRa networks and all the technology that's associated with that. But the other thing which we have found in here is that we also need people who understand animal behaviour. Now, animal behaviour is really, really important to making sure this technology is applied appropriately. And if you don't understand animal behaviour, then you may be putting lines on the map which are quite contrary to animals' natural use of that environment or natural locomotion through the environment. And then finally, we're looking at where do people go in that landscape. One of the projects which we are developing with Auckland Council, Auckland's our largest city, is how to separate people and animals in the regional parks, which are able to be accessed by the general population. And that becomes quite significant when you are also trying to protect sacred burial sites and other things in those landscapes. So there are a lot of potential cultural advantages by having this type of technology that you can actually protect multiple parts of the landscape, but allow people full access to the rest of the landscape. Finally, we're looking at outcomes. So from a societal point of view, we are able to assure society that we are meeting the best needs of the environment and of the animal. From a consumer point of view, we're able to place the animal in the environment and we are able to provide evidence that that animal is being treated well and being fed well. Biophysically, we're able to extract more value from that environment without doing damage to it. And from a business point of view, it's opening up opportunities for new enterprise, for continued operations of those businesses in those environments, so freedom to operate and the ability to extract more value from the consumers. So that's the story so far, and I will hand it back to the facilitator. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. That's fantastic. Yeah, a good canter through the storyline of virtual fencing. I don't know if you've been picking up on the chat. There's been some sort of broad questions and then some quite technical questions. Can we just come back to that really simple one, because welfare's come up in first session and second talk. Welfare, the electric pulse. Do two answers for me if you could. One, do you see any alternatives to electric pulses working in practice in the short term? And then secondly, tell us a bit about the training of the animal and how it gets used to it. So firstly, electric pulses and shocks and all that sort of stuff, please.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Interestingly enough, I hope my mic is on, isn't it, Tony? You'll tell me. All good. Interestingly enough, I have experienced the pulse myself. So, not. If anybody has experienced an electric fence pulse and grabbed onto one of those, this is nothing like that. This is much more like the stimulation you might get when you go to the physiotherapist and they put a bit of electricity through your muscles to stimulate them. So it gives you a surprise. Made me drop the unit. Didn't have any residual effects at all. Not like an electric fence where you could well shake for the next half hour. the amount of energy that is delivered is much, much lower. And it only goes between the two electrodes on the side of the neck. So it doesn't go to ground, so it doesn't go through the animal. So it is a lot less averse than an electric fence is. The testing that's been done basically shows that once the animal's trained, and most of the animals train within 48 hours, and the training package that they apply is about 7 days, most of the stimulus, or most of the warnings to the animal, about 85 to 90% of the warnings to the animal will be the audio cue, and the animal will respond to that and return to the herd. On the very few occasions where they actually get a pulse, quite often that might be at the setting of a new fence, where they actually actively test where the fence is. And you can see records where they will go along and walk along a whole fence line and just slowly bump against it to figure out where it is. And they work that out within 2 hours of a fence being changed. So they're very, very responsive to the technology. What was the rest of your question?
I think you've covered quite a lot of
other options. Potentially so. There's a company called Halter working in New Zealand, and they're using, they're actually using a, what would you call it, a vibration on, and a directional vibration on either side of the neck. The vibration is like patting the animal, and the animal moves in that direction, moving away from the fence. So there are some other options in train at the moment.
Yeah. My understanding was that the other three companies, which, and we're going to an example from Europe with no fence in later in the session, again, they're mainly using electric pulses. The story from Holt is very interesting. So it does give some opportunity that there may be some movement ahead if we go forward. That's cool, David. Yeah, just again, just to finish up, I've got a bit of time. What have your interactions been with the public on this, and their perception about the whole story? You've been doing it for 2 or 3 years now. I mean, the sort of general, what do the public perceive in this story as from a welfare and the whole sort of angle of having animals doing things we want them to do rather than them to being in charge?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because we've been controlling animals for the last 8 or 10,000 years, and a lot of the cases we've actually been doing it for their own safety, keeping them away from predators and all sorts of other things. We have been tracking, we've actually been tracking via social media, the responses of the public. So every now and then there'll be a media release, and then there'll be a flurry of activity on Facebook or Twitter or whatever else. And there appears to be about 3 camps in there. So what we get is farmers going, this is the best technology that's ever been potentially put out there, and we're waiting, we're hurry up and get it out. There's another set of farmers who say there's absolutely no way you could ever control animals like that. And then we have a small group of people who suggest that this is outrageous, that you should treat an animal like that. As I say, all of our observations of the animals in the field, and we have done some network analysis to look at whether or not their relationships are broken. You know, animals go and stand in the corner or whatever else because they sulk. None of that is apparent. As I said in the presentation, they still go to the top of the hill, even though the top of the hill is now a virtual fence, and they will all line up right alongside it. So we don't see any particular fear in the fence at this point in time. So we haven't seen any adverse animal behavioural signals to tell us that they don't train to it extremely well.
That's great, David. Thanks very much indeed. I think again there's some comments coming through on the chat box about this whole area, and I think again if we can maybe pick up a couple of things on there, you have a good chance to read it now. We've taken you offline. So thanks, David. Well, let's move on. Let's move up another dimension as we move to the area of remote sensing. When we've actually got Mark Jarman, who is head of agriculture with the UK's Satellite Catapult organisation, which is a UK company but fundamentally run by funded by the government. So Mark again will do a little bit of introduction within his own talk. He's going to basically talk to us about making space work for extensive grasslands. So Mark, let's pass over to you now, please.
My name is Mark Jarman. I'm Head of Agriculture at the Satellite Applications Catapult in the UK. And I'm here to talk to you today about the role of space across grassland systems. Myself, I've worked in the ag industry now for the last 10 years, both looking at it from a production viewpoint, but also from an ecosystem and environmental perspective. That's included looking at rangeland systems in Georgia, but also to progressive dairy systems in the south of the UK. My role is all about helping space be used by that system, whether that's end users like retailers to make better use of it for efficiencies and looking at emissions, to next generation technology providers who look at the ag industry as an area of opportunity for value creation, and how do we ensure that services are created in the right way forwards. The talk today will really explore how space can be used, some of the developments that are happening in companies who are selling into the market related to grassland systems, but also where the industry is going and why that should be of relevance to you in the audience. So first and foremost, just a bit of a background as to who the Satellite Applications Catapult are. So we are a UK government-backed, world-leading technology and innovation company. Because we get a grant from the government, we are neutral in the way that we operate. So we're a collaborator, not a competitor. We are fundamentally about translating research to commercialization and helping businesses grow. And that government support really puts us in a unique position in the value chain. Basically, a place to go for advice, guidance, and the latest innovations to do with satellite technologies. We are one of 9 catapult centres in the UK, and together with specialisms in manufacture, digital, transport, medicine, we really are driving growth to the UK economy. Our vision in terms of our agricultural work is about a globally resilient agricultural sector supported through UK satellite-enabled products and services. We exist to deliver growth to the UK, but fundamentally we do that through working with partnerships and users around the world, whether that be in grassland systems in the States to the cacao industry in Colombia. We work with everybody from retailers to development banks to spinning out new organisations to tackle some of this global societal challenges we face, all embracing satellite information from imagery to connectivity to navigation. And when we do that, we deliver some really impactful and pretty cool activities, whether that's the next generation of robotics to tackling global illegal fishing, to looking at how visualization tools could be improved to be utilized and developed for use across grazing systems. And we do that in many different geographies of the world. And why is it exciting is because space is changing and the world is changing at the same pace. And how we marry the two together is fundamental to creating value, addressing environmental concerns, and bringing social mobility and growth to populations around the world. And now I'm just going to show a video to you around how space works and the different technologies.
We live in a satellite-enabled age. You may not be able to see the spacecraft flying above us, but they are the very life support system that we all depend on every day. Earth observation satellites give us a unique vantage point. We can see the health of crops, the height of the sea, even the pattern of the winds. This helps us protect the environment and manage resources. Satellites enable long-term sustainable development and also play a key role in helping us respond to global humanitarian disasters. Communication satellites keep us connected, giving us data on the go, anywhere in the world. They are powering a revolution in how we see and share information, helping us to do business, create new networks, and even stay healthy. Global positioning satellites have fundamentally changed the way we navigate and coordinate. There are now thousands of products and services, even entire industries, all relying on accurate location and timing information from space. At the same time, it's getting cheaper to access. A new generation of smaller satellites are going into orbit, packing powerful technology. The cost of launches is coming down. The Internet of Space is coming, a network of connected satellites spanning the Earth. All of this opens up incredible opportunities for business, governments, communities, all of us. This is the new space age, and we're all part of it. We live in a...
Pretty exciting stuff, eh? And part of that is, creating massive amounts of opportunity and potential that's starting to be realized for the way that space can be used across ag systems. we've been using and embracing space now for 20, 30 years, and it's very mature in certain areas, like the use of it on controlling navigation of machinery on farm. But actually, the new generation of satellites with imaging capabilities, with the likes of Elon Musk's constellation with Starlink and OneWeb in the UK for global enabled connectivity, the possibilities are endless. And when we think about it from a grassland environment, we should be incredibly excited by what could be achieved. Space technologies really are the building blocks of innovation. And I think many people don't realize just how much of their lives are powered by space. From when the first GPS satellites were launched in the 1970s to the raft of ways that data now is distributed and the applications that have been created from that, which underpin most of our lives, whether that's navigating yourselves around if you're not locked down, to getting hold of the latest intel on who might be out there for dating. Space fundamentally powers most of our lives. And the same thing is true in terms of farming. We have huge ambitions of people out there who really want to push the barrier of how space can be used to empower solutions. From Elon Musk, as I mentioned earlier with Starlink, to Jeff Bezos looking at launch, to Virgin Galactic with Richard Branson. People seeing it as an opportunity to deliver intelligence, connectivity, information, to deliver value, but also societal growth and benefit to human populations. And from an agricultural perspective, it's incredibly exciting because of that changing capability. You know, seeing the detail now down to 15 centimeters in an announcement last week from space of the Earth, the same you would look at from Google Earth, to connectivity anywhere, anytime, to looking at it from the commoditization of space, of creating value, to how we might germinate seeds in a space-based environment moving forwards. And because of all this fast-paced innovation, we're really looking at it from a cost perspective. It is now so much more cheaper to access, so much cheaper to get information, to use that information and sell services at a value point that is going to be applicable to the user. And that's fundamental when we think about it from a livestock and grassland area. Those solutions have to be scalable, low cost, with clear value propositions. And because of that, space becomes very, very relevant across so many facets of society, from environment, from profit, from social, from legal aspects. You know, how are we really managing our land, ensuring we're looking at it from a food security perspective, but fundamentally from a sustainability viewpoint, that where we are sourcing our products, whether that's chocolate, whether that's wool that goes into cashmere, our environment has to be treated correctly. And the food system, the grassland system, as we want to call it, is complex, it's interdependent, global and local, evolving, responsible to knocks and challenges. And how we look at that system is fundamental, because if we don't have the right connection, then fundamentally, what do we have? Do we have anything? And that's where we think about now, with all of this data, with capability, how do we bring that together to really create those value-added propositions? So we take the Design Council's double diamond principle. You know, we go out, we discover the challenge space, we define the offerings, we then go out and develop that proposition and deliver it. And that's what we're starting to see now with many companies in the marketplace who are really taking the needs of users and looking at opportunities for value creation and addressing those fundamentals. You know, does the technology work for what the user is needing? Will it help that person? Is it financially viable? And then have we got the knowledge, the capability and the effectiveness as the team to deliver something that really adds value? And when we think about it from a global grassland system, whether that's lowland, upland, intensive, transhumanist type lifestyles, actually we're getting there with capabilities now that can really derive value. And Caron is going to talk about it from an environment systems viewpoint, who are really pioneering some of this data distribution from an ecosystem service perspective and value creation in a little while. But I've got a few other examples of great capability in the UK that's really offering into the marketplace. So from GrassSat by Resitech, looking at lowland intensive farming, but building simple tools like grass wedges, using 20 different data sets, including satellite data, to look at the way grasslands can be managed and serving that data up in key, easy digestible formats for the user, clearly saving them time in the terms of looking at pasture management, field rotations, field walking, really deriving metrics that can help the farmer increase value, which is ultimately in the way that the milk is produced. From Eosphere, a big multi-million-pound project in 2 countries, in Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, looking at helping upland grazers through country-scale assessments, bringing data together at scale, leveraging what's called the Open Data Cube. Layers and layers of historical satellite data, easily stored, manipulated, and analyzable at scale, which is a game changer for the way that this type of data can be used, enabling users to access that information for both on-the-ground planning, but also policy change, looking at landscape interventions, looking at it from a field partial perspective, ensuring that both the rangeland quality is maintained and looked after over time, but also communities can prosper and look at it from the value that the goods and products that they want to take to market can be optimized through using this data. And we think about it from a connectivity viewpoint, which is a hugely game-changing way now with space. We can look at the agricultural system. Inmarsat, massive multi-billion-pound company with geostationary satellites in space, really focused on global connected farm and supply chains. How do we look at the way animals can be tagged and monitored? Where are they? What is the health of them? Where are they going? How are pastures being utilized? How are they impacting upon environment and natural processes? Linking that automatically into cloud-based processes with edge-based analytics for real value creation and scale. And when we think about it from future space, that is massive opportunity for the ag system if it embraces it correctly, because the communities are becoming much more aligned. When we think about it from a data perspective, we are already at daily level imagery, and that's going to only increase as we put more assets into space. How we use that data is going to be fundamental, leveraging the latest machine learning, artificial intelligence, and neural processing technologies to take data, analyze it, get it to users in the quickest, timely manner, will drive down costs, will make it more effective, more exploitable, and will start to enable it to really be used in combination with all these data sets. Fractionated and cooperative constellations, that will be a game changer. We're talking in the next 5 to 10 years here, but what that means is we're able to program and utilize data in the way we capture it in different ways. Why should we be only capturing 4 or 5 wavelengths? We should be thinking about it to program it to visualize and capture the information and variable that we actually want and distribute that need across constellations. And then when we have all of this data, how we move that around in terms of supply chains, transparency, traceability, completely encrypted and unhackable communication satellites and processes within them will really revolutionize the way we can digest and use information. And from that connected world viewpoint, information will flow, autonomy will happen. The way we control and look at the farming community, the grassland services that can be derived, will really scale and become applicable. It will be true from my viewpoint that systems will be looking at it from having a chief technology officer looking at managing these systems from a farming viewpoint, taking data, utilizing information, products, services at scale in the manner that's going to create value. We will be looking at a truly ubiquitous connectivity system. And that's exciting from the way we look at it from livestock, from animals, health, from tracking the movement of insects and from a biodiversity viewpoint. Connectivity enabled from space linked into terrestrial systems will be a massive enabler for use across agricultural systems and rural communities. And that will really allow us to move to proactive decision support. Instead of thinking about it from what has happened, where we might describe the problem, we might capture it, we can monitor it, we're reacting to it, to thinking about real forecasting. What are we doing to predict what will happen? How do we then look at the interventions? But fundamentally, how do we get to the viewpoint of prescription, of influencing and enabling users to utilize this data at scale with clear, actionable advice that creates value to them, saves them time, delivers environmental benefits because they can look at the way the landscape is breathing and changing and go about their daily processes to ensure they have longevity and resilience. Space is a real enabler to that. It should excite the grassland communities around the world. It should be a huge enabler for that. And part of it, it's just part of a big system. So we can look at it way beyond agriculture, into logistics, into environment and habitat mapping. It's just a single point of truth of data that we are all beginning to realize the potential of. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Mark, thank you very much. I hope you very much opened the eyes of our audience. It's interesting to state the obvious that you've only had a couple of questions, some pertinent questions. I think one thing to come up with those questions is one of them all dealt with very well, I think, by Karen in his presentation, and the next one's again about GPS tracking. Can I slightly move that question around by just thinking when we talk to extensive farmers in UK about tags or collars that tell them about animals, they get that. We talked about virtual fencing, they actually get quite excited about that. We talk to them about remote sensing, they don't quite get it. And I think that sort of accessibility to that sort of thing hasn't yet come across. Can you reflect on your interactions with the cereal, arable, the lowland farming community, and how they're taking this area on board, and how it might really genuinely move into the extensive world?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, I think what you've got is a community that's been promised a lot over the last 20 years, and probably been, particularly in the UK with cloud cover, it's really failed to deliver on the imagery side, because people want data when they want it, and to be told, sorry, you can't have information for weeks or months is just not. It's not going to turn them on from a service perspective. So what we've seen really over the last kind of probably 2 to 3 years is a step change in the way that data is both accessible and the different types of data that's available, which is then delivering that capacity for routine monitoring across the grazing season or the crops production cycle. And that changes the dynamics of the customer who kind of start to see value from the services that they're procuring. But also with technological changes in terms of infrastructure analytics, the cost of accessing this has become far more relevant, particularly to the livestock, dairy and grazing system. And work that we've done previously is kind of validated that actually where arable systems have been scalable and there's been a cost benefit proven, now with the advent of a lot of free data and therefore just added value on top with the analytics, the price point is now starting to be there, that actually users are willing to take the risk and the punt initially on services from providers. And as we now start to progress through time, that value is being justified and therefore confidence levels are increasing. So it becomes a much more of a practical tool for farmers.
Yeah, just to sort of follow on a little bit then, I mean, a couple of questions here have come up about measuring grass fundamentally. Again, thinking about the grasslands we have in extensive systems, which are a bit more complex than intensive grasslands. But I mean, are people, do you have examples of people who are actively selling and buying that information now in the context of grazed livestock systems? Have you got some good examples of that?
So I think
where do you think it's going? That's probably sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the sales cycle and service cycle it's still in its infancy. I think you can see from the example of Rosatech with GrassSat, you know, they've launched that product in the last 2 years. So you would still, you know, suggest that their kind of market share is still way below where they would like to get it to, just whilst they build up that kind of credibility in the market. I think that therefore, when you look at kind of the challenges of making measurements from imagery to do with grass swards and vegetation assemblages and different species, it's highly complex than when you're looking at kind of uniform cereals. The work that's being done to transition from research in this area into those commercial offerings is happening at pace. I think what you will see now over the next kind of 2 to 3 years, particularly in a European context, is more robust services being launched into the market. From our work that we've been looking at in Australia and New Zealand, you're seeing some more mature offerings available, but partly that's driven by the climate as well, and the grassland models, which for predicting growth, which are critical with bringing all this data together. their maturity and applicability is a little bit more relevant for that system than trying to apply it here in the UK.
Great, Mark. Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. We'll move on now to the next session of 3 speakers, and again we'll go through a similar sort of transition from animal to landscape to a different sort of landscape, because we're going to talk about data, towards again the remote sensing world. So what we have here are sorry, I'm just moving back to my 3 speakers. So our first speaker from the commercial futures, the future potentials, is Oscar Berntsen from NoFence, who are a virtual fencing company. And Oscar is very much the inventor and the chief, and very much at the heart of developing this system, based in Norway. We've heard quite a lot from David Stevens, but in terms of UK and in terms of Europe, then NoFence are the sort of lead in this part of the world. So if we can pass the mic to Oscar.
Thanks for having me for this conference. I'm pleased to be invited. My name is Oscar Berntsen. I'm from Norway. And the thing about me is I don't like fences. That way I'm kind of similar to goats, I think. So many years ago, I started thinking about what if I could have goats without fencing. Would that be possible? Then the time went, and I learned technology and electronics and everything, and it was more or less, I have to find out whether is it possible to have goats without fencing. So I started to work on prototypes, and the time went, and the technology is now become a reality in Norway. So the goats that I'm having around me here is wearing the technology that we have developed at NoFence. The collars that the animals has around their neck they tell them where to roam. The farmer can draw on his cell phone where he wants them to be, and the collar will start beep when they leave the pasture. And by that they turn around and go back into the pasture, because they have learned that if they do not, they will feel an electric pulse. So that's the easy way. That's the invention actually. And this fence replacement technology is now a reality in Norway, and we have in my notes here we have 16,000 collars in Norway, and 6,000 of them are used on cattle. So we think that we are ready to scale this, and we will try to kind of change the food industry by using more of the food production from pastures. So we have now seen 4 years of piloting with our pilot customers in Norway, and we think that UK might be the best place to start for the rest of the world. The things that we have proven is that animal welfare is it is something that has there's good animal welfare by using the collars, and we are also kind of proud of the collars. They are solar powered, and actually they are self-sustained with power all season. And the third thing is that the user friendliness is now okay. All the customers in Norway are telling us that this is easy to start using, and the animals are learning the technology fast. So we are ready to scale, and UK is next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oscar. We're going to move on. I say we'll come back to questions for all three of these companies together as a group, and hopefully you can answer some of the questions on the screen when they come through, Oscar. So we'll move on now to our second commercial speaker, presenter, who's Ian Wheel from the UK-based Breeder. Breeder is, I think, very much a data company and very active in the beef world, and I think are moving from more intensive beef systems into extensive. So we can try and pick up from Ian the progress there, and I think it will be very useful to our discussions later, because data's come up as an important issue both in our first seminar and the second one. So please, let's go to Ian.
Hi, I'm Ian Wheel, the founder of Breeder. Thank you very much for having me. Today I'm going to talk about how individual animal analytics can really help extensive grazing systems into the future. So Breeder was founded on the premise of looking at the current livestock sector and a number of challenges. One of those big challenges is delivering productive animals to a high spec, at the same time living up to provenance and quality. And currently we have an ecosystem where specification is wildly different depending on system and output. And we see this as an opportunity to try and increase our performance across all systems. However, there's some challenges to doing that. The disjointed supply chains and data feedback, EID use across different systems on individual animal analytics, EBVs, BDs and EBVs are obviously at the moment calculated on intensive systems and not actually related to extensive systems, although there is some correlation, and actually ease of use to make decisions on farm. So what Breeder's developed is the ability for us to help track the supply chain through adding digital contracts as animals move along. We have farm management systems that integrate with wayheads on farm, help farmers do everything they need to track animals on the farm. And also, as they then trade those animals, tracks the data along the supply chain, which helps us predict when those animals are going to be ready, helping the farmer make better marketing decisions, but more importantly, enable us to get genetic feedback and performance feedback. As a company, we also then support producers in using that data to help them finance based on the value that they're building up in that animal. However, one of the exciting things that we are very excited about in the future and really relates to extensive system is the reducing cost of genomics and being able to link the parentage on individual animals through to the data that we're able to capture them in Breeder. And we see this cost coming down all the time. There's a number of companies in the livestock sector, but also those outside that are currently bringing down full sequencing of genomic data. But even things like parentage tests, we now see it around $30 to $45, and we expect this to reduce even further in years to come, where it becomes commercially viable to start for every beef producer to know which sire, which dam each one of their calves come from. Why is this important? Well, we're already doing information and analysis against sires on farms here in the UK, and this is one farm which has got a number of sires that are used all across similar systems, so it's rather large, but you're able to then see which sires are producing calves with high daily laid weight gain, so this is the performance of the offspring of those calves, and which ones are producing the highest kill weights as they go through. So you can see here that the difference between sires of producing a 1.3 to 1.4 daily live weight gain of offspring is 200 pounds per animal, and that doesn't even take into account those sires of producing calves that don't grow at 1 kilogram a day. So why does this matter? Well, as a business using individual analytics, we're able to significantly target which animals are going to be in spec, which obviously reduces discounts, but delivers an animal that customers want. We're able to help animals finish up to 5 months earlier. In that example before, actually with a half a kilogram a day difference, around a 7-month difference. And this saves significant amounts of money on feed, whether that's grassland or feed that's having to physically be fed to the animal. It has a huge benefit to the producer to be able to not only save on that feed or use that feed for other animals that are going to grow. So the opportunity cost of having lower growth animals becomes a big issue if you're able to use genetics as well as other performance indicators such as medications that we capture through the app. You're able to make those decisions in real time, which animals you should be keeping, which should be moved on. The reason this then matters from a UK perspective is obviously if you're able to have this sort of impact on the 1,000-odd farmers that we're working with already, is that if you can do that, there's 500,000 out of a herd of a bit over 2 million in the UK that we can have in spec. This can reduce feed costs by 3.6 million tonnes, but still producing the same number of animals. This has a huge saving and benefit for farmers. And on top of that, by doing that, we can actually significantly reduce the carbon impact that we're having through growing animals at a faster rate and producing similar, if not more, amounts of beef to feed the world that's demanded already. So as breeder, we currently have around 1,000 farms across the UK. At the core of everything is helping the farmers having it easy to capture data online, offline, and integrate with their various waste systems. So very interested to talk to anyone who's wanting to build out individual animal analytics on their farm or research networks that are very interested in using that data to build analysis around groups of farms and operations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Great. Okay, fine. We'll come back to you or some of your issues that you've raised in a minute. And then again, let's again move up the scale again to go in, comes back to space, where we've got Karen Pugh from Environmental Systems, which is based in Aberystwyth. And he's a remote sensing specialist in a company with broader environmental markets, and is going to show certainly some examples of some of the questions that people have been asking already on the Q&A after Mark Jarman's chat. So if we can go with Karen, please.
Hello, my name is Karen Pugh. I'm a senior remote sensing and survey consultant at Environment Systems. We are an environmental and agricultural data consultancy based in the UK. We provide evidence and insight from satellite imagery. Today I'm going to talk to you about how we are using satellite technology to develop a hands-free tool for monitoring extensive grassland systems without the need for a plate meter. Let's start with a crash course in satellite imagery. Broadly speaking, there are two types, optical and radar. Optical satellites capture information from the visible and infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We think of optical sensors as how our eyes would see the world. Optical satellites provide information on crop health and are widely used to monitor grass yield. Unfortunately, optical imagery is affected by cloud cover. When it is cloudy, the image will be compromised, causing gaps in the data. Radar imagery is a bit different. Think of it as how our hands would feel the earth, how rough, how wet, or how smooth it is. Radar imagery provides information on the structure or texture of the land surface. The unique selling point of radar is that it is not obscured by cloud cover, so it provides a continuous and uninterrupted source of data. This is particularly useful for when monitoring grassland fields where cloud cover is persistent and regular data is required. So why do we want to measure grass? Well, grass is an essential crop in livestock production. It is often the cheapest and most efficient form of feed on farms. Farmers need to know how a field is performing so they can make decisions regarding stocking rate, grazing rotation, and fertilizer applications. Grassland is generally measured using a rising plate meter. This is required to estimate daily growth and farm cover and is often expressed in kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Collecting this data across fields every week can be very labour intensive and are not always representative of variation seen across a field. Radar satellites can be used to measure grass. Here is a time series graph of radar backscatter over a typical grass field. It shows continuous, uninterrupted monitoring over time. Where shorter grass has less biomass or less structure, the radar signal is lower. But as the grass grows, its structure becomes taller and denser, and this is reflected in the increased radar return to the sensor. In our modelling, we use plate meter measurements collected by sheep, beef and dairy farmers across Wales to model kilograms of dry matter per hectare from radar data. In this graph, the farmer measured data is the blue line, and the radar modelled data is the orange line. As you can see, they track well over time. The model can be applied at a field level to visualise change over time. Here we are looking at the modelled data tracking 2 fields over the course of the season. The orange field contains more dry matter and the blue field less dry matter. The model developed in Wales is also transferable to different environments. Here we are looking at small paddocks in Colombia, roughly 100 hectares in total. Persistent cloud cover over Colombia means there's little scope to use optical satellites for grassland monitoring. In Colombia, we tend to use a radar-first approach to guarantee a consistent source of data to help farmers make management decisions. The model is also very scalable and can cover extensive grassland systems. Here, we are looking at the same model applied to a 50,000 hectare farm in New South Wales, Australia. This demonstrates the potential of the model to estimate average farm cover across an area that is too vast to sample with a plate meter. In summary, both optical and radar satellite data are suitable for monitoring extensive grassland pastures. They can provide data that is usable for farmers to make more informed management decisions. The unique selling point of our radar approach is the consistency of the data. Even on cloudy days, our model will provide a grassland reading. And finally, the technology is highly scalable and can cover thousands of hectares in a single pass, reducing the requirement for more traditional methods, or simply measuring grass where it was not previously feasible to do so. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'll be available at the end to answer any of your questions. For more information, please visit our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Okay, so we've had the 3 commercial future potential stories, we labeled them, and there are some questions coming up on the chat line which are partially being answered. What I want to do is just, again, if all 3 of you are happy to put your screens up and just come up with a together. Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you a technical question, but I'm going to ask each of you a difficult question, the same one. So the difficult question for you to think about is, in this partnership between commercial companies and potentially academics and extension workers, how can we improve the incentives to make all this work in practice? So that's the difficult one. Just what are the incentives that you guys in the commercial world need from governments, from agencies, to make that partnership work better? So that's the question for the difficult one. Can we just part that and you think about that? And then what I'm going to now do is just quickly ask each of you a pick out of one of the technical questions that have been coming through, if I can. So Ian, basically the question is, how's data getting fed back to the farmer from the end of the food chain? How effective is that at the moment? In terms of once the animals left the farm, how effective is data coming back to the farmer?
Yeah, well, it's critical. So we have the supply chain in the UK is usually, for the extensive systems, usually end up at finishing systems still through into the abattoir. And we also have a big sort of dairy bred, which do go from dairy bred calves through to extensive and then into finishing. So what we are seeing, and the reason that digital contract is important, is what the digital contract that exists between the supply chain with breeder actually enables the permissioning for that data to be fed back, because otherwise you have data silos that are already established and you don't get that feedback along the supply chain. And as we know, all the breeding decisions are made at the breeding end, and quite a lot of the finishing and processing decisions have then never had any visibility of it. And so I think making that data feedback go back is where we're seeing huge benefit, and it's the benefit on genetics, definitely. It's also the benefits of welfare at a calf level, as they go through, and how animals are fed and so on, especially from the dairy grade before they go back onto extensive systems. And then, you know, what we are now starting to see is sort of a focus and a collaboration between those farmers in the different stages of the supply chain. People who go the whole way through themselves, and therefore the feedback comes to them anyway, and then it's about data analysis and making sure they're making the most of it in terms of sire and feed and medication decisions.
Yeah, cool, thanks. I think, again, we'll come back at some point on you about the challenges of extensive systems where getting data is also a bit of a challenge from the other end, the animal end. Oscar, can I come to you with one again that's come through, I think, from the earlier welfare question. So you've now got 16,000 collars on animals, mainly in Norway. What has been your experience of talking about the welfare story to farmers, the users, and to the general public?
Yeah, it has been a year-long, many years of trying to make documentation on the animal welfare issue for us, and the food and safety authorities in Norway has been very cautious and forced us into collaborating with universities, and it has been really time-consuming, and one part of it is how strong is the electric pulse is one question, but I think the most important question is, how do the animals behave? Do they behave in a way that could indicate stress? So that has been the main, and also how fast do they learn? And in our experience, it's not how fast in time, but it is how fast in experience. Because you could learn by putting them in a very small virtual paddock, and they will learn very quickly, but maybe a bit more stressful environment. So the time is not that the most important thing, we think, but time has been important for the society in Norway to get to know what is this virtual fencing about, and the skepticism has come to the surface, and it has been answered. We have tried to be very open with everything all along, and in Norway there is not much skepticism left to. I think we have answered everything. Yeah, so I don't know. I hope it's the answer to your question. You're muted, Tony.
Sorry to follow up, Oscar, very quickly. Have you got an ongoing debate in Norway about the welfare story? Have you got people continually complaining? Have you?
No, the debate has more or less ended, but it has been very heated at times. Absolutely. So we have been forced into something that we more or less didn't want to do at that time. But when I see back at the time, I think it was very important that that the time that has been spent on animal welfare issue has been very important for us and educating for us also. But you know, the idea behind everything is that the fencing is not a good thing for animal welfare. So that is, and my idea, if the invention did, if animals did experience electric pulses very often, the invention is not a good idea. So the success of the invention is that they actually don't get that electric pulse that often.
Ilan, do you want to come in? I think Ilan from Israel wants to interrupt.
Very impressive, Oscar. Have you tried, do you have experience with other animals, horses, for example, or any other animals? What is your experience with?
The idea is it's endless of possibilities, and the horses and pigs has been, especially pigs, has been one of my, I look forward to trying on pigs and also on horses, but we have not done any work on that. But we know some customers that has been using the cattle collar on horses. But it is not, we say it is not for horses, but the experience is good. I can say that much.
Thank you.
Okay, again, just again to go to Karen. Karen, if you just want to pick up a technical question again, there's been quite a number around the sort of how do you measure it, how does it work, but just maybe to try and come up with, if the future of grassland measurement is radar, because of grass equals rain and rain equals clouds, in temperate grasslands at least. Just again, where are we at with this sort of complexity of the grasslands we get in our upland extensive areas throughout the world, where we've got native vegetation mixed with other stuff, compared to monocultures of lowland grass? How's that going to be overcome?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, so our initial modelling has been done in upland farms in Wales and lowland farms in Wales, and it's a very, I mean, in terms of where we are with it, it's almost a beta product at the moment, and there's more development needed to be able to identify different species. It's quite, at the moment, it's just quite a simple tool which uses the radar signal to try and estimate that, what we sort of call the golden number, which is that kilograms dry matter per hectare. It's not sophisticated enough to sort of look at the different species. It just gives you that golden number, as we call it.
Yeah. Okay. One of the issues will be just what do people need? What is it they want? Fine. So can I come back to my big question of you three before we go to the broader group of 6? So where do you think the incentives are needed to help you get where you want to go as commercial companies, and particularly in working with quite a lot of the people on this call who are academics or extension workers? So Ian, do you want to go first? I'm just sort of pick you because you were we've got Ian, Oscar and Karen, just again to be
Well, we've already done quite a bit of work with research groups. So people like Rothamsted here in the UK have been very supportive. We're doing stuff with SRUC on research as well, and we have been supported through sort of government grants to do that. So, but in terms of like the incentive, the main incentive for doing that is to actually partly data sets. So we have machine learning models to help support growth rates. So back to your data collection question, you don't have to collect data every day on weights of animals. So it is partly about building those models. The other part is around actual access to industry and being able to support step changes in innovation. So for us, research is a big part of what we do, and as I was saying in my last slide, the environmental impact and all of that comes from standard models that are built out of research institutions. So, the ability to work with research to do that, build up records across farms. Like we've now got a data set of about 80,000 animals in our system, and there's, we need farmer permission to use it, but it's there, and which comes back to your data question. And so that we now can offer something back as well. So, I think it's been very important, and there's some great people that we've worked with to get to where we are today.
Cool. Oscar, do you want to pick up that? Can you do it quite small, quickly?
Yeah, I was trying to write down an answer to the chat and didn't follow that good, so I'm sorry. You are muted, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, I was going to go back while Oscar's still thinking about that question. Karen, do you want to come back about that sort of partnership between commercial companies and?
Yeah, I sort of echo Ian's comments really. So to develop this the algorithm that I've currently talked about, we've done sort of work with Aberystwyth University, who sort of specialise a lot in grassland. But sort of it's the access to growers and their expertise. So I'm very much coming from a satellite technology background, but having access to growers to sort of test our new algorithms, our new approaches, and having access to almost their data to sort of to ground truth what we're doing, to make sure that the outputs from satellite technology are actually meaningful and what the farmer or what the growers need, and to be able to sort of interact with their sort of software platforms and how they look at their data, how they use their data. We want that to be as seamless as possible, so to interact with whatever platforms they use.
Cool, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm just looking again at time, and again we've actually got ahead of ourselves slightly in terms of timing, which has been great for everybody concerned, but we want to make sure we have a discussion, but not too long a discussion. So let's now open up, and can we bring the other early speakers back online, please? Mark and David. And we'll just try and do so Claire has been summarizing a few of the issues, and together we've got a sort of list of highlights of the sort of argument. So we've an issue about welfare, we've got a question about data, and I don't think we've picked up ecosystem services story too much. This issue about who pays for some of this stuff, where we've actually moving between farmer and food system, but also with an ecosystem services angle. So let's go back to the data story, and who wants to chip in with the question about how do we integrate data, how do we get it to work together, and who pays for it? Who wants to go first, guys? It is guys, I'm afraid.
Tony, I'll have a crack. Just the comment back in terms of that ecosystem services and who pays. And looking at that, so we've got a really interesting situation here in Queensland, where I live. We have the Great Barrier Reef just off the coast, and one of the key adverse impacts on that is agriculture and grazing, and potentially overgrazing in some situations. So if you look at a technology like virtual fencing, there's an enormous potential for that technology to be applied to optimize grazing pressure, and say to integrate say feed-based monitoring, so biomass assessment by satellite, ground cover assessment, and then look to automate that process where cattle are moved away from areas that are starting to lose ground cover. At the end of the day, though, the cost of that, I mean, there's some debate around this at the moment, I suspect, but the cost of that system will probably exceed the production benefits that can be made, and it's going to be up to, I think, our taxpayers or the government or our community to decide, should we be subsidising that sort of technology because of the potential benefits for the Great Barrier Reef. So yeah, that's one of my bits of thinking on that particular topic.
Yeah, Tony, we've sort of had to deal with this in building the business, and the sort of combination of two things, or three things really. One is there is cost to this supply chain already that exists that can be removed. So not necessarily the farmer that pays, but it's the way things are done. So so a good example of that is if you think of stuff like agent fees or commissions that happen already in the supply chain, we're looking at replacing them with digital technology and making it significantly cheaper in doing that. So that sort of pays for itself and makes it better for the farmer. The other is productivity benefits. And then the final bit from our perspective is like, how do you make this data useful to your customer. So a farmer should never share his data unless there's a value back to him on doing it. And the value to the processor or the retailer is that they can start getting visibility of supply that's coming through that previously they didn't have that sort of visibility of what was coming. So there's we've very much seen it as the supply chain itself working together. There's enough benefit, but it is a challenging one, and who shares and how often you share the data still remains a challenge. At the heart, it's the farmer's data. So.
Yeah, cool. Because one of the conclusions I think from the webinar one was very much that some of this kit and the software, the systems are quite expensive for farmers who are not traditionally very rich in simple terms. It's the low input, low output systems in many cases. So how is that paid? And somebody said, well, look, if the farmer's got to pay for all of it, it ain't going to work. It's got to be basically spread either down through the food chain or arguably into the ecosystem story, as Mark was talking about there. How do we get that to work? With space, is that? I mean, go on, please. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Stevens here. Just some commentary on that because it's really important to us. So, as an exporting economy, about 95 or 98% of all the agricultural products that we produce are sent overseas, so they go somewhere else. So our general public has the opinion that the farmer should pay for all of the ecosystem services, or the consumer should pay for all of the ecosystem services. And therefore, if they want to impose fencing of waterways, we have farms where fencing of waterways will cost somewhere between $2 and $5 million. And the expectation is that the farmers will pay for that. And our problem is that we send our products to the EU and to the UK and to China, and we participate in those markets where, for example, the UK government has just provided support for farmers to provide ecosystem services. And so we have to compete with that, with our product prices, when you guys are actually being paid to deliver that. So we have a completely unlevel playing field. And it's extremely challenging for our farmers to buy into the whole concept that they have to pay for it all.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So again, one of the questions that come up in talking about the well, it's effectively the UK's conservation schemes, the new versions of them coming along. The question is, as how are those done? I mean, I think space is one of the examples where, to be fair, there's quite a lot of public support for the availability of that. Somebody pays for the rocket to go up into space, Mark, doesn't it? And then provides the like of Sentinel data relatively much cheaper than if you were the only person buying it. It's spread already, but how do we make it accessible to individual farmers, and how do we make that data usable will be a clear issue. You know, how do we talk about cost? Because that's what all farmers talk about. How much is it going to cost? Yeah.
Well, I think that it's always, with many of the companies we work with and try and support with their product and service development, the obvious change that you want to make with them very quickly is, you know, understanding their user and what are you actually needing to deliver to that user that's going to create value for them. Too much is a technology push, throwing cool, sexy looking information, nice, pretty pictures to them, and they're kind of left with a little bit of a, well, what am I going to do with it? And I think that's the step change that is starting to happen with some of the successful companies, is the clear insight that they can give a farmer that says, don't walk here, go and walk over here in this field to understand what's happening, saves them time and efficiency and cost. And the metrics that are therefore being delivered to the user are the ones that are critical to them and therefore going to make them buy that service. In terms of who's integrating the data, making it accessible, that's the challenge space for much of the service providers like Environment Systems, is bringing that together in a usable, exploitable manner, but where the power is that data is the data. And there's a question in the chat linked to ownership of that data that the farmer supplies into this, and therefore where does the power dynamic and ownership and governance of that data exist which once you start to amalgamate becomes very powerful from a supply chain and value chain viewpoint. So there's dynamics there we've got to address.
Cool, that's great. Anything to add, Karen? Are you cool with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm all right with that.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I'm keen we don't spend massive amount of time because we're doing well. So the welfare question, I think that's come up a few times. Let's try and come to some sort of conclusion on that. David, I'd be honest to say I haven't really been convinced that I know what Halter are doing. I don't think they've got any academic reports. There's no paperwork, whereas most of the work done on virtual fencing and the stimulus used to discourage the animals from passing over it have been the likes of work done by CSIRO and on electric pulses. So these alternative approaches they're doing, if it is better, how do we actually get that? Because it needs to go into academia, doesn't it? So I know others will come into the welfare question in a minute, but
yeah, it's still a great question though, Tony, in terms of putting it into academia. And so just for your audience to look up Dana Campbell and Carol, they've done a huge amount of work in the last 10 years looking at animal behavior and some work looking at cortisol levels and such like in animals who are exposed to these stimuli. And all of the data supports what Oscar was talking about. That says that the animals train very, very fast. As long as the training is both predictable and avoidable, which is what the whole technology is about, the animal can avoid it if it wants to, then actually the animals train to it, and it's a very, very low stress environment. So all of that information is in the literature. And it actually supports all of the observations that we make in the field, and Oscar has already talked about it as well, that the animals are actually quite happy to respond. And the other part of that too is if the animal is startled or spooked or whatever else, certainly the adjuvant's collar has technology in it which turns the fence off so that the animal can escape or run away as required, and then it will herd the animal back. So there's a lot of safeguards actually put into the technology that's available at the moment.
Cool, that's great. Thank you. Have you anything else to add, Mark? You're obviously another one of the animal people.
Yeah, I think the only other thing to add into that is certainly my experience as well, working with it to a limited extent with the Addison system here as well. But I think the other thing is the monitoring component that goes with a virtual fencing collar as well allows you to actually observe anything going wrong and be alerted to that. And yeah, so I think there's some really big benefits to that. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. That's great. Yeah. Again, I've got this question in my head about let's bring ourselves back to the future, and get you each to give us your prediction for which bit of the stuff you've been talking about will sort of revolutionize where we're at in terms of farmer or land manager use of the technologies we've been talking about. So the next 5 years, what do you think is going to happen that's going to make that difference? And we'll start again from the animal and work our way back up through animal to landscape to space. So what's going to be the thing that's going to make the difference to change things? I think this will basically take us around all of you. And see us end up. So Mark and David, do you want to start off with, what's going to be the transformational change you're going to see in the next 5 years in terms of precision livestock farming?
I think once we've got some commercially available, affordable, reliable smart tags, so an on-animal sensor for extensive systems, so long-range data transfer. Once we get that, that will absolutely revolutionise the way our extensive grazing systems operate and give us data that will not only be useful in its own right, like some of those examples I talked about before, but also give us objective measurements of what's actually going on out in the paddock, that a whole range of other issues would come to light and potentially enable adoption of a whole bunch of tools and systems that aren't necessarily being adopted, but because producers are now aware of what's going on out in the paddock, they will actually start to explore and utilize a whole bunch of other innovations on top of just that particular bit of tech as well.
David, what's your prediction for the future?
Next 5 years, I think that it's actually the integration of things like satellite technologies, which we do have commercially available in New Zealand in terms of predicting pasture mass and pasture growth, actually married up with the enabling technologies, things like virtual fencing, where you can actually point the animal in the right place in the landscape, is going to be quite significant. And what I think will happen with us in particular is we will move very fast beyond meeting the regulatory requirements of keeping animals out of waterways and into actually utilising the landscape more effectively. So we have quite vast tracts of hill country which are often underutilised because of their slope or aspect, and we will be able to point animals in the right direction so that they are much more effectively utilised. And as I said in my presentation, that will then lead on to things like feed quality changes. It'll lead on to the opportunity to introduce new species of pasture type, all those sort of things, which I think will move quite rapidly because our farmers are pretty driven to make change right at the moment, considering the legislation that's coming.
Oscar, you're an animal person for the example here. So you've come a long way in 5 years. Where do you think you'll be in another 5 years in this area?
This is really interesting and good questions, Tony. And I think someone that in the future someone will make success on integrating satellite data with soil data, with integrate and use virtual fencing to put animals where it is smart, just like it was said here. But I think in the future it will not be a discussion on data ownership. It will be a discussion on who can create real value for the farmer using data that is accessible from anywhere. Maybe it's a lot of data will be accessible from our hardware and from tags and from satellites, weather data, anything, and also soil health will become very important in I think in utilizing getting more value out of land, and I think ruminant animals will become extremely important once again in the Earth history.
Yeah, a few people have picked up the question about measuring carbon and also new approaches to grazing elsewhere have been mentioned in some webinar one, when people saw precision agriculture used in extensive systems being slightly more what's the right word? Yeah, more precise in terms of how it was being used. So Ian, everybody thinks data is going to be the solution. So how do we foresee integration, especially again thinking about the extensive systems which you have yet got to get to grips with in terms of getting data from it?
Yeah, look, I think we have half of our farms are on UK extensive systems. They're nothing like family friends I have in Central Australia. So obviously there's variations to extensive systems, but I think Oscar's point on the amalgamation of that data, like our machine learning algorithms already take into account feed and genetics, but not yet genomics. You combine that with fencing data and you combine that with other things. But I think the real thing that you'll start to see is how that benefits. So the way we see that benefiting the farmer in the future is if you know the genomics at birth, you have forecasts, and you can start to market those animals knowing they're going to hit a certain ribeye area with eating quality standards and everything else. So farmers can make real decisions months out on whether they should market their cattle or not. That's why we're also monetizing through financing, because the virtual fencing can tell you the animal exists. So then you can finance that animal. That becomes an asset that banks don't currently value, even though it's appreciating in price. So I think it's the services and benefits you wrap around it for the farmer to enable the farmer to see real benefit out of it that helps this technology grow, but it also helps the farmer adopt it as well.
Yeah. Again, just to sort of try and bring that in with what was mentioned. I mean, so Mark came up with quite a long list of things you could use basically wearable technology for, being produced by either different or similar companies. At what point do you think you're going to be using that data, and how do you get those individual bits to connect with your broader dashboard of animal performance, etc.?
So we're already using things like water trough weighers, which are remote sensors in every sense of the way, so that, because weight is revenue essentially from a farmer's perspective, and weight per hectare is then the yield and profitability that they're making. So we're already adding some of that data in. We did some work looking at adding bolus data in and methane sensing data in a while ago to look at environmental. So very soon is the short answer. Like, being able to amalgamate that together and have a central dashboard for a farmer to make better marketing decisions, financing decisions, culling decisions, very, very important.
Cool, thank you. So Karen and Mark, we've come to your bit again. I think this is you're the untapped potential. So over the next 5 years, just at what point do we get the data that's possible from space data, and indeed UAV data, if we want to again be sort of all encompassing? At what point do we see that being integrated and become really useful to a broader range of customers, rather than just the sort of, to be fair, some of the agencies who are interested in ecosystem services at the large scale, but the individual farmer, the individual rancher around the world. How do we? What happens next? So one of you want to go forward, and the other one can follow up on the sort of transformation that's needed to make it usable for.
I'll leave Karen to address it from an imaging perspective. I think for me, the next 5 years, it's about connectivity, and that seamless ubiquity of connectivity from space and terrestrial systems. And what that will enable in terms of movement of data, both live telemetry information in fields and on animals, into the cloud at speed, and to integrate it and make it exploitable along with other data sources. And obviously from a rural environment perspective around the world, satellite connectivity is fundamental, and making that happen due to these new constellations will be a massive game changer for many systems, not just food.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of the imaging side, I think technology is only going to improve over the next 5 years. So the launch of more satellites will increase sort of the frequency that we are able to provide farmers and growers with data. Currently, we're sort of, we're still on 5, 6 day, 12-day revisits in terms of when the sensor will pass over your farm. And if you're working with optical, again, you're subject to cloud cover. But over the next 5 years, I can see there's been the increase of satellites being launched into space, which will provide sort of almost that instant data when the farmer needs it. As sort of working in the last few years in the sort of grassland environment, I've sort of come to learn that the grassland farming is very dynamic. The changes happen very, very quick on the ground. Sort of the cattle will go through a field almost at the moment quicker than our satellites can sense the field, especially in dairy cattle. So I think the increased frequency that we will get from more satellites in the space will be the biggest sort of game changer from an imaging side of things, and also the improvements of those sensors in terms of the resolution that we're currently achieving. I think Mark mentioned earlier that we're down to centimeters, so it's only going to get better.
Just to add on to Carol, I think it's the emergence of new incumbents in this sphere. So Amazon have gotten into space. Why? Because it's data and information they can leverage on AWS. It's 20 seconds now from an image being captured to it being available to a consumer. So if you think about it from speed of transfer of information to a customer and a user, it's just changing rapidly, and that becomes the cost just then just drops like a stone.
Yeah, and its visibility becomes obvious to a wider community as well at the same time. Great, guys. Okay, and it is guys in this situation. I think I want to do my thanks here. We come to the end. What I want to do is remind all the participants, and I've been watching their numbers, and they're just slowly going down. So at this point, we should now respond to the alert I've got about people leaving. Let's leave on a high note and finish at this moment. Just remind everybody the recording is going to be available next week. Just go to the BSAS website and pick up there, and also look at their events calendar. So thanks from me, and I think Cled's going to finish off for us. Thank you.
Yeah, just from the three organisers, BSAS, CAAP and Stapleton, to thank all the speakers. I think it's been a really interesting webinar. We've raised a whole lot of issues really, and we've just touched the surface. And now that you know everyone else who's working in this field, I'll hope that you'll keep the interactions going. So thank you very much, all of you, all the speakers and all of the participants, and to Tony for chairing, and to BSAS for doing the groundwork and getting it to run smoothly. Okay, so good night, everyone. Good morning to some of you. And we hope to see you again in other webinars that we're going to organize. So bye, everyone.